So in this video I wanted to go over some color stuff. Some people have been asking about it, so I thought I'd make a video on it. In my opinion, color is one of the most subjective parts of art, so there's no real way to do it. There's no rules or anything. So the stuff that I'm going to go over in this video is kind of just my personal way of doing things, a bit of my thought process. So yeah, starting with the color panels, which is where you're going to be selecting all of your colors. I use Photoshop, so mine's up here on the top right. It looks like this. It's kind of this square with the hue slider on the right side. Depending on what program you use, it might look a bit different. They're all the same really. Photoshop has this one as well, the HSB slider, so you can adjust your hue, your saturation, and your brightness all independent of each other. I'm kind of used to this default one. I think some programs have like a color wheel with a triangle in the middle of it, but whatever you use doesn't really matter as long as you can select your colors from it and you know how to select your colors from it. With this one here, you've got your hue slider on the right, you've got your saturation in this square going from left to right, and your brightness vertically up and down. So let's go over what hue, saturation and brightness actually mean. I'm going to be referring to those terms quite a lot in this video, so it's probably a good idea to cover those first. So your hue is going to be the actual color itself, so say like red or blue for example. Your saturation is going to be how much of that color is coming through. So if you've got a more saturated color, then more of that color is going to be showing through. If you've got a less saturated color, then less of the color is going to be showing through, so it's going to look more gray. And your brightness is basically going to be obviously how bright or not your color is. So these three things kind of make up every color that you can pick. So with that, let's go through some of the main process. So I'm gonna, for this video, use a circle. So the first thing obviously you want to do is select your color. I don't usually have a way that I select the color. I just kind of think like, oh, this needs to be red, you know, so I'll pick a red color. People have kind of their own preferences to the range of colors that they might pick. So for this example, I'll make this circle orange. And you can see that I've kind of picked a not fully saturated orange. This is kind of just my personal preference. I don't tend to like move things all the way up into this heavily saturated zone. Although you can, I mean, if you prefer to pick those kind of colors, then that's totally up to you. I'm just kind of used to picking these kind of subtle colors. Yeah, this is what I kind of mean by like color. It's just really subjective, so you kind of just experiment and just find what works for you really. The next thing I usually think about is the shadow colors. So obviously the first thing that you want to do when you select your shadow colors is just to make the color darker. So obviously the shadow is going to be darker, so let's go ahead and do that. So here I've kind of just selected straight up a darker version of the orange that we had. Obviously it doesn't look like much at the moment, but you can kind of see that by doing this, it's kind of created like a flat look to it. You know, there's not a lot of color variation. It's not very interesting to look at. So there's actually a few things that we can do. And one of the main things that a lot of people do is to actually shift the hue around. So in this example here, I'd actually shift the shadow color more towards red. You can see here I've literally just moved that hue slider down to the red area to kind of change the color of the shadow a little bit, and it immediately makes it look a little bit more interesting. You know, it stands out a little bit more. Obviously, again, nothing really special going on here, but I'll keep working on these throughout the video to kind of show what things will look like as you start to refine things. Usually when you hue shift stuff, you want to think about your ambient color. So let's say for example you're drawing a scene that's more like has a warmer feel to it, using kind of warm colors like reds or yellows and oranges. More of an indoor scene. In this situation, maybe you'd want to shift stuff more towards red, so your shadows would kind of be more red in color. On the other hand, if you're doing kind of an outdoor scene, maybe you want cooler colors, you might want to start mixing some blues and greens maybe into your shadows. So we'll do another example here. So in this example here, I've kind of just mixed some blue into the shadows. You can kind of see it gives it a more like colder feel, and it's kind of added a little bit more color variation, obviously, as opposed to just like making the orange color darker for the shadows. This kind of makes things a little bit more interesting. So yeah, in general, I would say don't do this, where you just kind of use the same color for the shadows. I would lean more towards this kind of stuff, where you kind of start to play around with colors. Try to shift the colors with your light and shadows. So the next thing that you can do is actually mess with the saturation of your shadows. In general, shadows tend to be less saturated, so if you're going for like a more realistic look, then it might be an idea to adjust the saturation of your shadows a little bit. We'll take this example here, and what we'll do here is we'll actually turn down the saturation of the shadows. So what I've done is pretty much I just selected the shadow color, just turned down the saturation of it, painted that in. And what this kind of does is it kind of pushes back the shadows a little bit, and it kind of brings forward the areas of light. And you can kind of use this to create different focal points in your pictures. So if you want to draw the viewer's attention to a certain area in your picture, you can use more saturated colors where the light may be, and then kind of push the shadows back with those desaturated colors. So that's pretty much it as far as picking the shadow colors go. Obviously these are like very basic examples, so I'm gonna kind of try and build upon it throughout the video. So the next thing I usually do is to pick the color for the half light. If you watch my previous tutorial on light and shadow, I kind of go over a bit of half light in detail, but it's basically the areas that are in light but the surface is more facing away from the direction of the light source, so they kind of appear a bit darker. So the way I actually select the half light color is I actually just grab the shadow color and I kind of paint a little bit into the light area. Have to blend that in. Obviously here is kind of basic. You've just kind of brought the shadow color into the light areas. There's actually a few different things that you can do with this. So what I usually do is I usually select the half light color that I've just kind of blended in, and I'll actually just manually adjust this up here. So maybe if I want to make it more saturated, for example, I actually just bring the saturation up a little bit like that and paint that in instead over it. Again, just kind of like experiment with different colors that you might want to use, because you can kind of get a lot of cool effects by doing stuff like this. One of the best ways I can show this off is by blending between yellow and blue here. So the way digital color blending works isn't actually the same as it does in the real world, so it kind of does like some weird stuff that you wouldn't expect. So if I select the blue here and then I select the yellow color here, right? Usually you'd imagine, right, blue and yellow to make green, but in a digital art, it kind of makes this weird like gray color. So you can kind of get some muddy tones if you just straight blend like certain colors together. So it's usually an idea to kind of sometimes go in, let's say here, select this, and kind of just like kick up that green a little bit and paint that in there to kind of get rid of that like gray color that we got. Just makes it, you know, look a little bit more natural. So you can actually kind of see the difference there. Yeah, we're kind of basically just doing the same thing here with the half light. We're kind of just adding some other colors in there, adjusting some of the blended colors. So I'll do the same thing on these other two examples. And it's like, this kind of thing really works quite well when you've desaturated your shadows, because it creates more of a contrast in saturation between the shadows and the lights. So obviously here we've desaturated the shadows. If I go in here and start blending into the light and then just adjust that saturation there, So that's the half light. Still some pretty basic stuff. We're gonna add a few other things. What I usually tend to do after this, just to add a little bit of variation in light, is I'll add like a secondary light or a bounce light. I'm kind of lazy when it comes to this. When I do stuff like bounce light, I'll usually just select like a desaturated version of the shadow color. So I'll do an example here. So if we imagine the main light coming from the top left here, and maybe a secondary light was coming from the right side, right? What I'll usually do with this secondary light is I'll just select the shadow color, just kind of desaturate that a little bit, maybe make it a little bit brighter because it's a different light source, and then I'll just paint in that secondary light like that. Again, this is like kind of my lazy way of doing this. There's some other things that you can think about when you do bounce light. For example, let's say on this example down here, maybe I have like a green wall or something like this. Bright green, yeah? Sure. Some of the light would hit this wall, kind of bounce off. The bounce light, or the light that's reflected off of that green wall, would actually pick up some of that color. So it would actually cast kind of a green light. So something like that maybe. It's kind of indicating there's a green something on that side that's reflecting the light there. Usually you kind of want to think about this kind of stuff if you're like painting a scene or something with various objects in it. You kind of want to think about how light would react around the scene and how different objects would interact with each other. But as I said, I'm kind of lazy with this kind of stuff. I usually just draw characters that are just on like a plain background, so I don't usually think about that kind of stuff too often. But yeah, if you're drawing like a scene or something, it's usually good to think about. And again, here it's kind of added a bit of color variation as well. So really that's pretty much it as far as picking the main colors goes. I'm gonna go and refine these a little bit just to kind of show a bit better what they might look like more finished. Alright, so I've kind of gone in and refined them a little bit more. I could probably spend a bit more time like blending stuff together, but this is just kind of a quick tutorial thing, so we won't really worry too much about that. So on the first example here, we've basically shifted the shadow value more towards red. In this example here, we've shifted the shadow values more towards blue. And in this example here, we've desaturated the shadow values a bit. I actually forgot to write that down. And we've added a bounce light on the right side. That's more of a green color. There's one last thing for these examples. I'm gonna add a highlight onto them. So with the same principles as before, with the hue shifting, with the highlight, you also want to kind of change the hue around a bit. So in this case, we're gonna go the opposite direction from red, which would be more of a yellow color. Maybe even going into a bit of that green, and obviously making the color a bit lighter there as well. So if I want to add a highlight, you can see it's kind of more of a yellow highlight there. So the last thing I want to cover in this video is blend modes. Blend modes are kind of just another way you can push colors around. Blend modes are kind of like you have to play around with them a lot. A lot of the blend modes I don't actually know what they do. So sometimes I'll just kind of go in and see what things look like before I finalize stuff. So there's kind of a few main blend modes that I tend to use. So I'll go over those just quickly in this video. The first being the color dodge blend modes. Color dodge is basically a way to push the light areas. This is how I use it at least. If you click here above your layers, this box that says normal, you can actually select between different blend modes. So if you see here color dodge, if I then select like an orangey color like that, you can see it kind of just really pushes the vibrancy of the lighter tones there. So you can kind of use this if you want to emphasize certain areas. I know a lot of artists tend to use the color dodge in this way. Another one of the blend modes I tend to use is the overlay. Overlay is kind of similar to color dodge. I just find it to be a little less vibrant. So you can see here, just kind of a more subtle way to push those light areas. You can also use it in the darker areas as well. If you select a darker a darker color there, you can kind of push some of the dark areas as well with the same blend mode, so it's kind of useful there as well. Another one that I tend to use is the color or the hue blend mode. I'm gonna be honest, I don't actually know what the difference is specifically between the two, but they kind of do roughly the same thing. So if I set it to color and I select for example, a blue, and I just paint over the whole thing, it will turn the object blue. You can kind of use this to kind of add some color variation in certain areas if you want. So if I select the red color here, and I kind of paint in the shadows a little bit there with that red color, I'm kind of just pushing the shadows more towards red there. So you kind of use it in that way. Again, just experiment with things and see what works best for you. And the final one that I find the most useful of all of them is the saturation blend mode. So it basically does what it says on the tin. It can be used to just adjust the saturation of certain areas. So if I select a desaturated color here, so any gray, and paint on that layer there, I can actually just desaturate certain areas. And if I select the saturated color there, I can actually just push the saturation out. But like I said before, how you can kind of use saturation to push things back into the picture. Here I've just painted a bunch of really saturated colors, and if I throw on like a highly saturated color here, like this red or this blue or green or any color that's just like really saturated, you can see how much that stands out. So you can kind of use this as a way to add like certain focal points to your piece, as a way to draw the viewer's attention, and the saturation blend mode I find is a really great way, a really fast way of doing that. So yeah, I'll just quickly go over the stuff that we covered in this video. So we went over the hue, saturation, and brightness. Hue being the color, saturation being the amount of color, and brightness being obviously the brightness of the value. We started by selecting our base color and then selecting our shadow color, making sure to hue shift the shadow color. So just sliding and adjusting this hue. We then adjusted the blend colors here. I'm just adding some more variation to the colors, kind of pushing the colors a little bit more, and then just playing around with different blend modes here to adjust the colors even further, and using the saturation here as a way of creating focal points. So that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you found it helpful. I hope there was some stuff in here that maybe you didn't know, so maybe you learned something new. If you found it helpful, then let me know. If there's anything that you'd want me to cover in future videos, then also let me know in the comments, and I'll try and get on that. But yeah, until then, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.